One of the dangers of Western thought, influenced by the scientific method or rationalism or maybe all of those things, and I want to be sure that you understand that I am not against science, although I do believe that the whole purpose of scientific exploration really is to have a deeper understanding of an amazing creator. And certainly the closer we get into the smallest things of the universe around us, we see the intricacies of a creator's hand. And the farther out we go into the universe, the more we see the hand of a creator. But what this thought process, I think, does for us is it causes us to try to put things into boxes, into some kind of order and process. Now, the reason I'm suggesting that this can be a problem, particularly when we're thinking about the Apostles' Creed and the events that happen that relate to us the life of Jesus, particularly as it has to do with our redemption, is that it's too easy to separate out all the pieces of Jesus' life and try to figure out what happened in what sequence and in what order and when. And so we talk about the conception, and then the birth, and then his growing up, and then his arrest, and then his trial, and then his crucifixion. And we look at all the things that he said from the cross, and we try to assign them to some kind of order and try to figure out, so exactly where in this process did redemption actually happen, and what is the order of things. And I would suggest that a healthier way to look at all of this is to consider it all a single event. And rather than to try to put some kind of chronology to it, simply to understand that this is all a single event that God did in order to bring us back into fellowship with himself. And so we're looking then at the process. We saw in our previous conversation that Jesus was crucified and talked about what that might mean. And the next two words, or three words, are dead and buried. What I want us to understand is that the crucifixion and the death and the burial, the descent into hell, which we'll look at again in our next conversation, should not be put into some kind of sequence necessarily in terms of exactly where and when things happen. But I think we can, at the same time, see from the words on the cross that these things happened. That as Jesus cried out from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do," he was extending forgiveness to us through what he did on the cross. That as Jesus cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" that we can understand, and this is what we'll focus on today, the death part, that something happened between the second and first persons of the Trinity that is beyond human understanding, and yet simply it says it, and so we need to somehow try to put words to it, that as Jesus cried out from the cross, "It is finished," that what he had come to do was indeed complete. That when he finished his time on the cross with "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," and then died, that happened. Now, from a human perspective, we want to put everything in nice, neat order. But I think it would be healthier for us just to simply say that this is all an event that happens together. And what we find then in our confession is indeed that Jesus did die and was buried. And when we confess that he did die and was buried, we are confessing much more than a physical death. Yes, I happen to believe that, not just happen, but from Scripture and from my understanding of how we read Scripture, that the events of the cross were so incredibly excruciating for the man Jesus that he physically died. Just the crucifixion itself would have been enough. Although we find that his death was relatively quick for a crucifixion. The reason that the knees of the two men crucified next to him were broken was so that their deaths would be quickened. Now, the process that happens on the cross is that when you're hung with your arms up, as Jesus was, that it creates a great strain on the breathing process. And that in order to breathe, the crucified one pushes himself up with his legs to take a breath. And this constant up and down just wears them out. Eventually the diaphragm rips away from the lung cavity and the body suffocates. But it can be a process that can take days in a strong, healthy man. The knees of the other two were broken so that they could no longer push themselves up to take that breath. And then their asphyxiation was quicker. We find, however, that Jesus' knees were not broken, and in fulfillment of Scripture, that none of his bones are broken, because he died prior to that needing to be done. And so his physical death was a real physical death, caused by crucifixion. But I also believe that the relatively short time that it took for his physical death is accentuated by the spiritual application of what happened on the cross. That yes, Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, was in some way that we cannot understand or explain, separated from the Father. And that when he cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's what he was expressing. And the reason I have to believe that is because if there was no separation, and that's the separation that we call eternal death, then Jesus' physical death was not enough. That is to say that we need him to be separated from the Father because his death is for us. Now, just the death of his body wouldn't make a whole lot of difference for us. But the separation from the Father is what we're really confessing here when we say that he died. Because it is that separation from the Father that is the true consequence of our sin. Yes, physical death is a consequence of sin. There was no physical death until sin came into our world. But the true and eternal consequence of our sin is what we call spiritual death, which is an eternal separation between us and God. And if Jesus did not suffer that separation, then he did not fully complete for us what would happen to us. So when I say, in speaking the words of the Apostles' Creed, that he died, or that, and it says, he was crucified, dead, and buried. So he died and he was buried. I'm saying those words in confession that that is what he did for me. Not just a physical death, but also a spiritual death. A separation between himself and the Father. Now, the great story and the continuation of the Apostles' Creed is that we get to resurrection as well. When exactly does all this happen, and how does it happen on the cross? I don't know except we do have his words, and we might put them into some kind of sequence. And here's the danger, right, of our Western desire to put everything in sequence and order. He did cry out from the cross, "It is finished," which would indicate to us that the separation was over. He did cry out from the cross, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," as his body died, which might indicate to us again that the separation is over before the death of his body. But we don't know. We simply make those speculations. And again, the healthier way to look at it is simply that this is a single event. And that he did die. Yes, his body did die. But more importantly, there was a spiritual death. A separation between the first and second person of the Trinity, or between the second person of the Trinity and the first and third persons of the Trinity. And maybe one of the reasons that God is Trinity, how do we know? We know that God is Trinity because that's how he speaks of himself in Scripture. Why is he Trinity? Maybe he is Trinity so that this separation can happen. So that the second person of the Trinity, who became incarnate and is the man Jesus Christ, a perfect man, the God-man, could indeed become our sin, could indeed experience this separation from the Father in our place and for us, so that we would not have to experience that separation. And that's what I believe when I confess that he was dead and buried. Stay with me for the rest of the story. We'll look at another phrase here, a phrase that maybe and sometimes is a bit contested or maybe confusing, the descent into hell, and try to understand what that phrase means, because it's tied, I believe, to both the death and the resurrection. And then look at the resurrection and see what it is that we believe when we confess that he was raised on the third day. Thanks for being a part of the conversation, and God bless you.